Welcome, friends. It is great to have you. Thank you so much for being here, sharing a little bit of your precious time with us this evening. I hope that you have something good to drink. Hopefully, if it's something responsible that you're drinking. But we are digging in today to some exciting stuff. I'm excited to share the time this evening with a new friend, a scholar. We are going to be spending some deep dive items into the book of Daniel. So before I dive into that, first of all, I would hope that you would subscribe, like, share, get this out to anyone and everyone that you think would benefit from it. As I've said before, during the live stream, you'll be able to scan the QR code in the upper right corner. That is the best way to connect with not just myself, but the website, any of my own personal academic pursuits. If you want to be a part of our Discord channel, that's there. If you want to financially contribute to the ministry, that is there as well. And just to try to be extra special today, I made something special to remind you all to subscribe. So I'm trying to figure out this thing, and hopefully it looks good on your screen, but please do like, subscribe, share, do all that good stuff. By the way, some of you have already noticed you actually can subscribe to YouTube and join as a member now. So you will be able to get some extra members only items. You'll notice on your screen there is a goal today in our conversation with our special guest to get to 15 super chats. The threshold for those are, you can do whatever you want, but the threshold is $5. If we get to 15 of those today, then I will go live and we will dissect and dig into what I think is some good academic work towards the dating and authorship of Daniel. Probably the most controversial topic that you can probably get into with Daniel. So hopefully today's conversation will spark your interest on that particular topic. So without too much further ado, I would like to kick us off with today's conversation. And with that, welcome to the conversation. Wendy, how are you this evening?
I am doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm so excited. I am so excited to have this conversation. And I will have to say that the way God has miraculously worked to just connect us randomly, I'm going to tell a little bit about how that all happened, but just randomly. And I had a wonderful conversation with you getting started, but man, I'm excited to dig in today. So you reminded me that it's Wendy Widder. Did I say that right?
You did.
All right. Good deal. Good deal. Well, where are you hailing in from? Where are you calling from?
I am in near the Twin Cities of Minnesota. So up north here in the cold.
Is it true that they say Minnesota up there?
Well, I'm not actually from Minnesota, but yes, people do say that. I'm from Wisconsin, so we don't say Minnesota.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, I have to tell a little bit just before we get into your background. You know, most of those that are watching have been digging in with me on a series on Antiochus, Epiphanes, and Daniel, and kind of diving into the ins and outs. And after one of those episodes and doing some search and research and whatnot on some questions that had popped up, I went into the famous Logos Bible study software that I use. And in that research, I found some commentary work that, lo and behold, happened to be by a lady by the name of Wendy Widder. And in my research online, I happened to find another article on your website that I guess you don't pay attention too much to the website, do you anymore?
No, I really don't. I still pay for it.
But I happen to just fill out the contact form, and you never know if people are going to respond.
I do pay attention to that. Yeah, I do. I don't put much up, but I do pay attention if people.
Yeah. And so I filled out the contact form and shot that over to you. And man, it was a quick response. And lo and behold, a couple days later, we were having a conversation, and you were kind and gracious to share a couple of hours of your time today as a kind of a stepping stone from that conversation. So it's good to have you.
Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into pursuing scholarly work, academic work? Tell us a little bit about all that background.
Yeah, well, I took a circuitous route. This was not really my life goal. When I was growing up, I just pretty much wanted to go to college, possibly, and get a degree maybe, but get married and have a family. That's what I wanted to do. And when I went to college, I got a teaching degree and I taught for several years and getting late into my 30s, and there's no movement on any sort of relationship front. I thought, you know what? I have to be prepared to make a living for myself if I don't get married, because not everybody does, and that's okay. So I after 6 years of teaching, well, 8 years of teaching elementary school, I decided that I needed a job, a career that would challenge me more academically. Teaching is certainly challenging, but I needed a different kind of challenge
Mm.
because I got bored. I got bored with the material. After I had taught it several years, I thought, why don't you kids know this? I've taught this
Yeah.
so many times. So that was a sure sign that it was time to maybe do something else. So I was also at that time working on a book, my first book, which was a basically it's a Bible study of Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. By
Mm.
faith, Abraham, by faith. And I was applying it specifically to living life as a single adult because I was in my late 20s and I just went through a really difficult breakup. And I thought, I need to come to grips with what it means to live the life that's in front of me, the
Mm.
life that God has placed before me, not waiting for something else to materialize, not waiting for what I think my life ought to look like, but I need to live the life God's given me. And so as I was writing this book, I had this scary thought that if I finished the book and I actually managed to find a publisher, which I was pretty sure I could finish the book, finding a publisher was a whole nother thing. Um, and and it got published and people read it. There's a whole lot of ifs in there, but if that all happened, then I realized people would probably believe what I said, because you don't pick up a book and read it unless you have some element of trust that the author
Mm.
knows what they're talking about. And you might disagree with how they get there, where they end up, whatever, but you assume that they're publishing something because they know something about it. And that was terrifying to me, and I was overwhelmed by the responsibility of claiming to tell people what I thought the Bible meant,
Mm.
and having them believe me. And I had grown up in a Christian family, a solid church. I had gone to Christian school. I went to Christian college, but I still felt like I needed to be a little better prepared if I wanted to write things
Mm.
for people to read and trust that I had some idea
Yeah.
what I was talking about. So that realization took me to seminary, because I wanted to keep writing material that was related to the Bible. And I had no aspiration at that point to be a scholar or an academic or anything. I just wanted to be better trained to write biblical materials for people in the church. Um, but I also knew that I had to make a living somehow. So it was a very long road. But along the way, God gifted me with professors and others who spoke wisdom and helped direct me and point me in ways where they thought my gifts and abilities lay. And so I ended up deciding that I wanted to be an Old Testament professor.
Mm.
I had taken a Hebrew course and had just really um, loved the way the language worked. And I realized I had always loved the message of the Bible. Um, but now I also loved the words of it, and I loved the way the words shaped the message and how
Mm.
getting behind the language helped me see it in a different way. And sometimes it just slowed me down enough to actually see what I had missed because it was so familiar. So I decided on being an Old Testament professor, which just kept adding on the graduate degrees I needed. Kept going to school. And about the time I was finishing that journey of education, the Great Recession happened,
Mm.
and colleges and universities and seminaries were not necessarily hiring full-time tenure track professors to replace those who were retiring. So there was a shrinking market for what I was doing. And I, over the course of the next several years, went through 4 years of hiring cycles. And in the academic world, a hiring cycle can take almost a year. It's
Mm,
just the way it works. It's awful, but it's the way it works. Um, and at the end of all of that, I came up empty, and there was no job. So at a certain point, one has to stop banging their head against a brick wall and recognize that maybe God is actually closing that door.
mm,
Uh, so between those hiring cycles, there were there were two on that side and two on this side. In the middle, I was offered a full-time job, doing some writing of research material. And I thought, well, I need a full-time job, so I took it, and it turned out to be a fairly bad fit for me. Um, I'll spare you all the details of that, but it sent me back to the academic job market, trying to find that job again, because I needed that sort of stimulation, that sort of challenge, not the one that was my daily job. This is a really long story, but at the end of that last hiring cycle, I'm in this dead end job, and I had given up on finding a teaching job, and I was empty and broken, and all the dreams that I thought I had prepared for, the things that I believed God had equipped me for, um, there was just nothing there.
mm.
And so this isn't actually answering your question, I'm realizing. Anyway, in
That's
all of
great.
that, I was asked to write a
Great.
couple commentaries, which I did. But I never did get that job, and I moved to Minnesota to start over, near my best friend from graduate school days and her family. And 6 weeks after I moved here, another friend set me up on a blind date. And a year later, I got married. And um, by God's generous provision, I don't have to have a full-time job, which frees me up to do other things for part-time work. And yeah, that's where I am.
I
And free
love
time
it.
to do interviews like this.
I love it. I want to just hit on one thing that you said that I really appreciate. The when you were first kind of telling that, the weight that you were experiencing of how, like, when you speak or interpret or speak Bible truths into people, making sure that it's obviously grounded in the text and that it's good. Um, Scholars would call it exegetically sound, or hermeneutically sound, whatever, right? But
Mhm.
just that it reflects what is truth. And I've experienced that in my own situation. It's interesting. I didn't know all of that because it's part of the reason why I'm pursuing my master's and then my PhD as well, because it is a weighty responsibility to
Mhm.
claim something to be what Scripture says and then have other people listen to you. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
There's a reason James says that not many should presume to be teachers.
Yeah,
I mean, because it's a weight.
yeah, it
It's
is.
a
It
it's a
is.
very big responsibility and not to be taken lightly at all.
So I have to ask you to tell a little part of your story that probably isn't a big deal to you, but we brought it up in our first conversation. I did not know that one of the positions you took over was for someone in the academic world that has had a massive impact on my life. Dr. Michael Heiser. I did not know this, but tell a
Mhm.
little bit about like that, and then how you got connected to Logos and Faith
Yeah.
Life and like that whole thing, just so that everyone's got kind of a picture of all that.
Yeah, so I met Mike Heiser on my first week or month when I was in Madison, and I had moved to Madison to attend the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and be in their Hebrew program, which sadly doesn't exist any longer. But at the time, and for 50 years, it was one of the finest programs probably in the country. And I had just started, or was just about to start, but I had taken um, a part-time job on campus working for the National Association for Professors of Hebrew, or NAF. And it was an administrative assistant, 10 hours a week or so, just keeping track of their membership records and making sure mailings went out and all that sort of stuff. And Mike Heiser was doing that job, but he was leaving it because he was getting ready. He just graduated and was getting ready to move across the country to Washington State and work for Logos, which is now Faith Life. And so because I was taking this job and he just happened to still be in town, he had a couple hours where he could just dump all of his knowledge of this job on me, and way more than I could absorb, but that's Mike. But, yeah, so that I met him, and then he left town, and I tried to figure out how to do this job he had done, and that was that. And then a couple of years, well, several years later, I moved out to Washington State to work for Lagos, writing research material for them. And I was on the same floor as Mike. He was an independent scholar there, and I was not. But it was good to see him and reconnect. And he had a couple sessions where he gave me some good advice and helpful. And so I appreciated that. And I was very, very sad when
Yeah.
God called him home. What we would all say
Yeah.
is too soon.
Yeah. We lost a very wise man, even though some don't agree with everything that he has ever said, but we lost a very wise biblical scholar. I have always appreciated his ability to allow others to disagree with him and for him to still like value their difference of opinion. He had a huge talent with regards to just engaging people in a way that honored. It's one thing that I'm trying to learn, but I don't do it nearly as good as him.
Yeah, he was academically generous.
Yeah.
Just was willing to listen and hear and disagree.
Yep. Well, of all of the things that you could pursue, you decided to pick a book that probably is one of the more, you picked a good one.
I didn't pick it. I tell people that I did not pick it. It picked me, or God picked it for me.
Yeah.
Daniel was pretty near the bottom of the list of Old Testament books I wanted to be serious in. Job, it was right there with Job, because it's so difficult, and also because the second half. I mean, the stories are wonderful and they're so rich, but the second half, it gets a little dicey. It gets a little dicey in interpretive traditions,
Yeah.
and in my particular tradition, I just felt like I can't keep up. I can't sort all this out. The book is so difficult to even understand anything if I have to understand all of these interpretations. And so I didn't want to go anywhere near it. But in one of my last years of graduate school, I was needing to build my CV because I needed to apply for jobs, and I also needed some cash. And so the seminary from which I had graduated, they kept up with me and kept after me to come teach a J term or a 2-week course in January or something. But I'd been too busy trying to pass my own classes to teach anybody else's classes. So, but at that point, I was like, you know what? I need money and I need experience. So I emailed the dean at the time and I said, do you happen to have anything for January? Because I could take a class. And he replied, I swear within the hour, possibly within 5 minutes, and said, yeah, would you like to teach Daniel? I thought, oh my gosh, no. But thankfully this was via email, so I couldn't actually say, of course, I would love to teach Daniel. The professor who'd been scheduled to teach it was willing to give it up so he could take his wife to Mexico. I'm like, man, I'd rather go to Mexico. Anyway, so I buried myself in Daniel for all of my Christmas, my semester break, trying to get ready to teach this 2-week intensive course. And I was very surprised. I thought, this book isn't quite what I thought it was. And I there's a lot to understand here without all of that interpretive baggage.
Hmm.
Um, and then I got stuck in the book because I ended up going back to teach part-time at that school, and because I was also finishing my dissertation, they wanted to allow me the space and the time to do that, so they kept my schedule pretty simple, pretty much a rotation of 3 classes, and one of them was Daniel. So I taught it like 4 times. And then somewhere in the middle of that, one of the editors at Zondervan, who I had attended seminary with, was walking down the hall, and she stuck her head in my office and said, "Would you like to write a commentary for a new series we have?" I said, Maybe." So she told me who to contact, and I got the list of what books were available. And Daniel wasn't actually available; somebody else was going to be writing it. And
Hmm.
so the editor asked me. He said, "Well, which book would you like?" And I said, "Well, really, the only book I spent that much time with is Daniel." And he said, "You can have it." I said, "Okay." So yeah, it just sort of built on that. And then when I didn't get a teaching job anywhere, I had no external structures to work on other books or be teaching other courses because I'm trying to make a living doing something else, and there's only so much extra time. So I got stuck in Daniel, and I kind of call myself a one-trick pony because it's what I do, Daniel.
Well, you've done other stuff, and I know that we're not going to talk about the textual criticism of the Bible. That's a book that I think is very important for people to understand what that is. You've had the privilege of writing two different. I think it's interesting because the two different commentaries I think are designed for two different things. You might want to share a little bit about that, but the exegetical commentary series of the Old Testament, specifically yours on Daniel, is designed. It's probably a little bit more meaty, a little bit more difficult to access for someone that maybe doesn't have a little bit of academic training and prowess. But the Story of God Bible commentary is maybe a little bit more designed towards pastoral ministry. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I sort of think of the story of God, and Zondervan might not like me comparing it to this, but the very popular NIVAC series, New
Mm-hmm.
International Version Application Commentary.
Yep.
It's sort of for that audience
Yeah.
where it's somebody who's serious about the text because you're teaching it and you're preaching it.
Yep.
But you also, so you want the meat, but you need it in an accessible way with applications and ways to think about how does this apply for me and my church. Um,
Yeah.
so that's sort of the way that one goes a little more.
Yeah, that's good. So, any of you that are looking to, obviously, this is a shameless plug. You're welcome to pick up any of Wendy's books that she's written. Amazon, you can get most of them inside of Logos if you are familiar with Logos. But I'm sure she would be grateful for you to dig in, whether you agree or disagree with everything that she's written. I want to start this out since I don't know if many people in the audience here really knows what discourse analysis is, because that's specifically your exegetical commentary. Do they call it ZCOT?
Yeah,
ZECOT? Is that how they?
yeah, Zika, Zondervan Exegetical Commentary on the Old
Um,
Testament, Zika.
so that commentary uses what they would call discourse analysis as the primary analysis or the primary approach to Daniel. Tell us a little bit about what is discourse analysis. Why is it important? Why does it matter? Kind of give us a high level on that.
Yeah, so it's not quite as scary as it sounds. If you think about just the 2 words, analysis, we all know what that is. You're analyzing something, you're taking it apart, you're trying to sort out how it works. Discourse, we know what that is too. It's speaking, it's communicating. And in this case, we're looking at a written text, and we're trying to figure out how the biblical authors communicated their message and why they chose to do it that way.
Hmm.
So there are any number of ways we can choose to say something. How many times have you written an email and backspace to rewrite it, to try to say it a different way, and you're weighing how your audience is going to hear that.
Yeah.
Do you want to start with something else instead of what you started with? How many times do you say the person's name? There's just, I
Yep.
mean, there's certain things we do in language that are choices, and they also communicate. Um, and so it's taking that idea and looking at the biblical text that way. So
Mm.
why did the biblical authors say something? So, for example, why does let me pick a good example here so I don't bury myself in a hole I don't want to get out of, or I want to get out of and can't get out of. Um, well, I'm just going to say it. So, why, for example, in Daniel 3, which is the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego,
Hmm.
why does the author use their names always together? It's never just Shadrach, it's never just Meshach, it's never just Abednego. It's always all three of them. And it's over and over and
Mm.
over. I mean, there's a perfectly good preposition he could have used
Mm.
them, they, but he doesn't. He just uses their names over and over. So I'm not going to give you the answer for why that is because I actually don't entirely know. But it's asking questions like that.
Yeah.
And in Daniel 3 and Daniel 6, which is the lion's den, you've got this interesting use of this and or these and these guys and those guys,
Mm.
certain guys. And it all depends on the translation you're using. It
Yeah.
might get lost in whatever because we like in English we like to smooth things over. Um, that's one of the reasons. I'll just make a plug. That's one of the reasons to use this because I do provide a translation that tries to capture those features that we
Mm.
sometimes lose in translation. So how does it function in that chapter where it's those guys and these guys? Because it means something. It matters for how we understand the message. The way the authors have written things matters.
Mm.
And so this commentary is specifically or especially interested in how did the authors communicate their message? Because in asking that, we can then figure out maybe what their message really was.
Yeah. So it's interesting that I love that you went to the first 6 chapters because my upbringing, which we talked about a little bit prior to this live stream, almost I would say predominantly focuses on chapter 7 and on. While obviously we know the stories and we know the lion's den and we know that, like, the kids stories that we hear and all that stuff. um, I don't My experience has been that most people don't study the first 6 chapters as much as they study the latter half of the book. um,
That
why
might
do
be
you think that is?
because I think some of that is because the stories seem easy.
Mm.
It, on the face of it, it seems like the message is easy to understand.
Mm.
Now, I would say that's not necessarily true, or that we're not actually perhaps getting the message and the meaning that the author intends us to get when we just find a hero in a chapter or
Mm.
find a moral for how to live. But I think on the surface they're easier.
Do you feel in your expertise that the first, the story in the first, or the stories in the first 6 chapters actually relate and are valuable to understanding the second half?
Yeah, I do. I don't think you can take the book apart. And
Uh-huh.
I think you have to have the basis of the stories to approach the prophecies in the second half.
Mm.
So the book of Daniel is all about kingdoms and kings, and specifically God's kingdom and his relationship to human kings.
Yeah.
So if you think about who the audience of this book was, we're talking about Jews in exile. They are a defeated people. They have lost all the components of their covenant framework. They don't have their temple, they don't have their land, they don't have their
Mm.
Davidic king. They're living in exile.
Mm.
Um, and they're living with these foreign gods, and Nebuchadnezzar worships other gods. And he, in chapter 3, arguably presents himself as a god. But think about who those people are, and this book, into that context, God uses these stories, these events, these things happening to people in exile to show that he is actually the superior God.
Mm.
Now let that sink in. Who is he talking? This is an audience of people whose God on the surface has been defeated. That's how the ancient Near Eastern people would have understood the loss of their temple and their city
Mm.
and their land. That's what they would have understood it to mean, that their God had been defeated by the God of the conquering king. That's how
Mm.
that's how the ancients interpreted warfare. A king fought on behalf of his God, and when his God won, your
Yeah.
God lost.
Yeah.
So the book opens, Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem, and then you could say, well, yeah, and then Jerusalem fell and Nebuchadnezzar burned it. But that's not what the text says. The text says Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, and God gave
Mm.
his king into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. So the events on the surface looked like Nebuchadnezzar and his God had won. That's what the news headline would have said.
Mm.
But the author of Daniel says, that's not actually what happened.
Mm.
That's what it looks like. But what really happened is that the God of Israel is in charge here, and he handed over his king to Nebuchadnezzar. So even though it looked like the God of the nation of Babylon, the other nation, was dominant, the message of Daniel in chapter 1 is he really wasn't.
Mm.
Israel's God is superior. And then you march through these stories, and in each one of them, God is showcased, the God of Israel is showcasing his superiority to these
Mm.
other gods. So in chapter 2, you've got this dream, and Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know what it means, and he claims to not know what it is, and his wise men can't tell. All the wise men of Babylon can't tell him. And here comes Daniel, and his God has the wisdom and the power to reveal it.
Mm.
So at the end of that chapter, Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, the God of Daniel he's wise, he's powerful. Education. And Nebuchadnezzar is learning. Chapter 3, we got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what's at issue there? They won't bow down to the statue. And Nebuchadnezzar says, he gives the heartbeat of the chapter when he says, who is the God who can deliver you from my hand? I mean, he's really elevating himself above a God to say that, but who's the God who can deliver you? He doesn't think that there's any God who can deliver these three guys.
Mm.
And, the God of Israel does. And at the end of the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar says, this is a God who has the power to deliver. So you see God throughout these chapters just show that actually, even though it looks like he's been defeated, he is superior to all these other gods. And you need to know that. You need to have that foundation that God is superior to all these other gods and the kings they represent before you get to the horrific events that happen in the
Mm.
second half of the book. Because you've just seen in the first half of the book, you have seen Israel's God show up. You have seen him prove himself to be superior in power and knowledge and wisdom to all the other gods. And then you get to the second half of the book where life goes really bad for God's people. And the kings in the second half of the book make the kings in the first half of the book look like nothing,
Mm.
almost saint-like. And there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of hope in the second half of the book. There aren't resounding victories. There's no one been saved from the fiery furnace. It's just pretty grim.
Wow.
But you need that hope and that assurance and that promise, those promises of who your God is from the first half to get through what happens in the second half.
Mm.
And chapter 7 is really what holds it all together. So in chapter 7, you have this Daniel sees the throne room and he sees God on the throne and he sees the one like a son of man coming in. It's
Mhm.
just this amazing picture
Mhm.
of what Daniel sees. It's the high point of the book,
Mm.
and it really gives the long view Chapter 7 gives you this cosmic view. This isn't just a defeat of one king or two kings, or, okay, another king, this God. This is all of history, and this is the God who is over all of that, and he has his king, and it gives you the long view. And you need that long view to get through the rest of the book.
So it's a would it be fair to say it is a theological like exclamation point?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, it's pretty important. I mean, if you pull out Daniel 7, I mean, Daniel 8 is grim.
Yeah.
There, when I read Daniel 8, the greatest encouragement that I find in Daniel 8 is that the bad stuff won't last forever, and
Mm.
God has evil on a leash. Doesn't say when it's going to end, but he does have it on a leash.
Mm.
So meanwhile, lament. And lament is okay. Lament is something we aren't very good at.
Yeah.
But it's very biblical, and you find lament in Daniel 8.
Mm.
Yeah.
So with all of this, most know that Daniel is one of the few books that is written in two different languages. You've got some of it written in Aramaic, some of it written in Hebrew. How does that fit into some of what you've just shared? Like why the switching from one to another? And it's not even like one half to the, I mean, like, tell us a little bit about where the transition, like, where does it happen? And like, do you have any idea why? And does discourse analysis help with that? Or,
Yes and no. I mean, every commentator has ideas
yeah,
about why.
yeah.
And you can read 5 commentaries and probably find 5 different reasons why there's Aramaic in the book. So the book starts in Hebrew. Chapter 1 is Hebrew. Chapters 2 through 7, starting in verse 4 of chapter 2, 4b if you care. 2, 4b. Starts in Aramaic and goes through chapter 7. So you've got this block of Aramaic chapters. And then chapters 8 through 12, you're back to Hebrew. So the question is, Hebrew is the language of the Old Testament, except for some in Ezra. But the Aramaic in Ezra, you can explain as being administrative correspondence between the Persian government and the land. So that makes sense to use Aramaic there. There's an isolated Aramaic verse in Jeremiah. There's a phrase in Genesis. But Daniel has 6 solid chapters, except for 4 verses at the beginning, 6 solid chapters of Aramaic without any obvious reason. It's not like this is administrative discourse or something.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's interesting is that those 6 chapters make they make a literary structure. They fit together in an interesting way. So if you just line up the 6 chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, chapter 2, which is the first one, and chapter 7 are both stories about someone having a dream or a vision that involves 4 earthly kingdoms and a 5th eternal kingdom. Okay, that's chapters 2 and 7. Move in to chapters 3 and chapter 6, and you have 2 stories about faithful Jews. In chapter 3, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In chapter 6, it's Daniel. Faithful Jews who face death for being faithful. Okay, similar stories, parallel stories. And then you move to the middle, and you've got chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4 is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's humbling, where he becomes beast-like, and he acknowledges that God is sovereign and most high and has given him his power. Chapter 5 is about Belshazzar, his successor, who Daniel takes to task for not learning from the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar. So in 4, you have a proud king, Nebuchadnezzar, humbled and restored. Chapter 5, you have a proud king, humbled and killed. He doesn't get his power back. So go back to, you've got 2 and 7, 3 and 6, 4 and 5. And if you were to map it all out, it could make this nice little, what scholars like to call chiasm. Um, and, the biblical authors and old ancient authors didn't leave us a record of why they may have structured things this way, but there aren't too many commentators who won't at least acknowledge that that structure is there.
Yeah.
And most, I think, or at least many scholars will say that, the whole chiasm is important, but it's all kind of pointing to that center, what's at the middle of it. And what's at the middle of it is these two stories of God humbling human kings. He humbles Nebuchadnezzar, he humbles Belshazzar. And they respond differently. And in their different responses, God responds differently. But those two chapters, proud human kings being humbled, it just brings to the fore again this theme message of Daniel, that this book is about human and divine kingship. And I love the contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Think of who Nebuchadnezzar was. He is you could argue that he's the quintessential Gentile king. He's like he's this paradigm of a Gentile king, right? He's the one that torches Jerusalem. He takes God's people captive. This is like the worst of the kings, right? You'd think that. But I think the book of Daniel presents us a Nebuchadnezzar who God is educating. God is teaching this Gentile king of Babylon, and Babylon in the Bible is the paradigm for all that's evil. And here we have the king of Babylon, the most powerful king of Babylon. But God is teaching Nebuchadnezzar, and you actually see him make progress. He goes from being the king who torches Jerusalem and wants to kill these people, and he's a flaming lunatic in chapters 2 and 3. But in chapter 4, he's humbled. And how does he respond to this humbling? He acknowledges that God is sovereign and gave him his power. And when Nebuchadnezzar leaves the stage, he's doing exactly what a Gentile king ought to do. He acknowledges that his power was given to him by God. Wouldn't we love for all Gentile kings of today to do that?
Yeah.
To acknowledge where their power comes from. So we can hate Nebuchadnezzar, but he exits the stage as the model, the paradigm for what a Gentile king ought to be.
Yeah.
And I say that because then you get to chapter 5, and here comes Belshazzar, and he can't read the writing on the wall, and he's terrified, and his experts can't read it. So he reluctantly calls in Daniel, and Daniel says, yeah, I'll read it for you, but first, let me give you a little history lesson. And he goes on he just takes Belshazzar to task for not learning from the example of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar leaves the book, he leaves the biblical story as the paradigm for what a Gentile king ought to be. And then we get Belshazzar, who becomes the prototype, the model, the paradigm for what the Gentile kings in the remainder of this book are going to be like. And then into the New Testament until we get to the man of lawlessness. It starts with Belshazzar. Belshazzar is the defiant human king who shakes his fist at God, thumbs his nose. But he's nothing compared to the guys that come after him. They get worse. But he's where it starts. So the book of Daniel gives us these two human Gentile kings and shows us their relationship to God and his sovereignty. And it shows us how a king ought to be, and it shows us how most Gentile kings probably are until the end of time.
I love that setup, especially taking the time that you are to give the backdrop and the narrative and the stories, and it's moving, because obviously I think most people that are watching right now would love us to just jump into chapter 7 and just like, let's talk about the dreams and let's deal with the, let's go there. Before we
You
exit,
cannot go there. You cannot go there until you have the message of these stories. That it is the God of Israel, it is God Most High in the book of Daniel, who is the one on the throne, who will humble human kings, who at the end of the day will win. And the original question here was, why Aramaic? Okay, I don't have a great answer for that, except it's the language of exile. It was the international commercial language of the day. So for Jews, Aramaic was the language of exile. The stories are set in exile. When you get to chapter 8, the prophecies, at least, we're looking back in the land of Israel. It switches back to Hebrew. That's one theory.
So let me ask you something about, I know that your expertise is the Hebrew language, and Aramaic, is it, for those watching, is it similar to, is it part of the same Semitic,
Yeah. They're
domain, so to
cousins.
speak?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
cousins. They use the same alphabet, so if you can read one, it makes it a whole lot easier to learn the other.
So let me ask you this, and this is going to be a very specific question because of something that came up previously. Do Aramaic cognates, do those cognate words have identical semantic ranges across languages that they share?
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. I wouldn't say that. It's too absolute a statement. They might share some, but I would not be willing to say that there's total crossover.
So does that mean that what drives the meaning would be the context, whether it's in Aramaic?
Oh, it's always context. Always context.
And what, as a scholar, what does context mean to you?
Well, how is it being used in the sentence, in the phrase, in the verse, in the book, in the chapter, in the book? How, you don't get to fill the meaning of it. You don't get to take a word and say, well, I'm just going to pick the definition I like best. Oh yeah, that's that one. Great. Oh, I got some great insight here because I picked a good definition. The text gets to decide what the meaning is. It's like when any words we use. I mean, if someone takes a word that you use and they give it their own meaning, that's not fair.
Yeah.
It's not fair to the communication that you're giving. You're not allowed to do that. Right? In our conversation, you're not allowed to do that, but yet we do it all the time.
Yeah, with the Bible. I agree. My question was, do you feel like, and I'm going to pick on laity here for a second, do you feel like the lay Christian, whether intentionally or not intentionally, do you feel like that happens in the way that they study a text like Daniel, if they're trying to get into the language and they're like, using something like Strong's Concordance or some sort of like baseline entry point where they go, oh, this seems like the right definition and I'm going to pick that one. Do you feel like that happens?
Yeah, sure, it happens. And it's understandable because you're in a context that's unfamiliar. You're in an ancient culture, an ancient writing. There's so much about it you don't have a grip on. And so you're trying to find a way to trying to find the way in. So I get it. And I've done it. I'm sure I've done it. But it's always a danger to be aware of. And I think sometimes just the self-awareness can maybe be enough to stem the tide of that. If you're at least aware of it and you think, oh, this is a great interpretation. It might be, but go make sure you're not the first one to say that. Because I had seminary professors who like to say, you're not supposed to be creative in theology. You can be creative in the way you communicate it, but creative theology is probably not orthodox or safe. So you always want to make sure you're not the only one who's saying it. And if you are the only one saying it, you better have a really good reason to say it. It's
Yeah,
not to
man.
say that's not to say all the traditions, historical traditions, are correct for sure, but you need to have good reasons if you're going to step outside those bounds.
Yeah. There's so much I would derail us if we went off on that particular dialogue, but maybe that's reserved for another time. I love that. Since we're talking about difference of language and Aramaic, Hebrew, there's also a duality in the genre and the literary structure inside of Daniel. So Daniel's unique in that it has narrative and it has apocalyptic literature. Um, any like reasons why, like how do you handle that, like I'm just kind of opening up the conversation on
Yeah,
like how do we
it's a
even
weird book.
tell.
It's a
Yeah.
weird book. Um, but the thing about the two languages and the two genres, depending on the commentators you read, sometimes commentators say, well, here's the first 6 chapters, those are the narrative, and then the second 6 chapters, the second half of the book, that's the prophecy and apocalyptic. So, pick which half you want to study and go for it, right? Or if you're into Aramaic, just study the whatever. But the book won't let you do that
Hmm.
because the narrative, the stories, are through chapter 6, okay? But the language difference is 2 through 7.
Hmm.
So chapter 7 is a problem here. Um, before it, you have all of the stories. It shares it shares the language of those stories, but chapter 7 shares the genre of the second half of the book.
Yeah.
So chapter 7 shares let me get it right, the language of what comes before, the genre of what comes after. You can't split the book.
Yeah.
You can't. And if you do, you shouldn't.
Mm. Mm. I hope the audience heard that, because I will be honest, I don't know that I've ever, even up until now, and you sharing this, I don't know that I've ever been taught to really study it as an entire book and really kind of you can't cut it in half. You can't separate things. People like to take, well, there's 4 visions. Like, let's just deal with one vision at a time. And like they kind of pluck it out and they deal with it and they analyze it and they structure it and they figure out kind of what they think. Um, but it's a great reminder for all of us to be aware of um, the mechanism through which this is communicated, and it's communicated through certain literary genre, structure, words, language, like all this stuff, and it matters. I mean, that's why we believe in inspiration. It was, I mean, this is all a part of why we believe this book is inspired.
Yeah.
Is God was behind it in a very beautiful way. Okay, well, now comes the fun conversation. Um, yeah, it's probably good that you get a drink of water on this one.
It's just water, I know.
Let's talk about probably some of the more divisive things that occur inside of studying a book like Daniel. It's funny because there seems to be 2 camps, and it stems around the dating and authorship of Daniel. Oftentimes, because there is an early date and a latter date, if you fit in one camp or the other, and I'm going to be very black and white when I say this, you're either Christian or you're not Christian. You're either, pro God or against God, like depending on, because of how, I know that's very like black and white. But from a scholarship standpoint, why is the dating of Daniel important to understanding the nuances of what's going on inside the book?
Well, first of all, like many of the books in the Old Testament, at least, the book doesn't make a claim for who wrote it. Um, in the only place so the reason Daniel is usually traditionally at least described as the author is because he's a character in the first half of the book and he's the one who has the visions in the second half.
Hmm.
But if you read those visions, each of them, I think each of them begins with this narrative framework that doesn't have to be Daniel. It's a third person. So in the third year of, or the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel had a
Mhm.
vision. Now, that could be Daniel writing about himself, but it wouldn't have to be.
Right.
So you get Daniel's I saw, I did, I saw. That comes in those visions. But the book itself does not make a claim that Daniel wrote it. So that leaves biblical scholars going, well, like most of the Old Testament books, there is not an overt claim for who wrote it. And then my brain just went that way. So I'm trying to get it back.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'll
With
stop there. You may follow up with something.
yeah. So would you say that there is, and maybe this is the first time someone has heard this that's watching. So what I'm hearing you say is, while you could have one author being Daniel, that's a possibility.
Mhm.
There is also a possibility for multiple authors.
Yeah. And whether you want to call them authors or editors, I mean, you'll find
Yeah.
different language in
Okay.
commentaries. But the fact of the matter is that we don't know a lot about how, and I'm just speaking for the Old Testament. The New Testament books came together in a pretty short period of time. So that's
Mm-hmm.
in many ways a different conversation. For the
Mm-hmm.
Old Testament books, we're looking at 1,000 years of time here where these events have happened and they've been written down and recorded and passed on
Mm-hmm.
and compiled. And we know there are later hands in some of the books. Um, if you look at the Pentateuch, which traditionally is ascribed to Moses, but Moses really unlikely to write everything in there. Like, did he write about his own death?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not impossible that God told him to do that, but that's a little weird.
Yeah.
It sort of removes that whole human authorship component if we say
Yeah.
Moses is writing about his death. So
Yeah.
we know there's evidence in within various books of later hands, of later editors, later scribes working with this material. Sometimes they update place names for
Mm.
a later audience who wouldn't know what that place was. Um, Somewhere in Genesis, there's a phrase, when the Canaanites were still in the land. Like, well, that must mean this is being written at a time when the Canaanites, or the Philistines, when the Philistines weren't in the land, right? Otherwise, how could you say it that way? So the Old Testament gives hints like that,
Mm-hmm.
that there's more than one person involved in much of the authorship.
Yeah.
And it's just hard for us to know who did what when. So those are hills I don't like to die on,
Yeah.
um, because in a lot of ways, for me at least, it it does not change how I interpret and understand the message of this book.
Mm.
And I'm sure people will disagree with that, but for my understanding of the message of this book, that God's kingdom will endure, that God is the sovereign over all, that he will call to account all human rulers, that you as God's follower can take heart because your God is the one on the throne,
Mm.
that you as God's follower can stand fast because your God is the one on the throne. Those things don't change.
Yeah.
However many hands you want to put in compiling Daniel, those things don't change.
Yeah.
Um, So I don't like to get lost in those weeds. Lots of scholars do, and that's fine. It's just
Yeah.
not my preference.
Well, and I think that it's a mature response. There are, for those that are newer to this conversation, the two dating traditions in Daniel. You have the traditional kind of critical dating for critical scholarship. That's what most people kind of consider as it's dated in the Maccabean era. Or the period kind of roughly 165 or some time period during the Maccabean crisis. But then you've got the conservative, or what most people would, maybe the traditional approach, what most people were brought up understanding is more of the 6th century, authorship. Um, And what's interesting about this is, there's so many different combinations, right? So you could have one author, you could have one author and editors, you could have multiple authors, you could have multiple authors and multiple editors. And then you could have some written at certain time periods and some written at different time periods. I mean, it gets really complicated really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for saying all that, and this is a very specific question, critical scholarship tends to get pigeonholed into, in fact, I even had someone on my Facebook pretty aggressively say that, well, because of your view, Mike, you're taking the critical position from a date standpoint, and therefore you're accepting, you're an atheist. Because Collins is an atheist, he's a critical scholar, and you're following some of his scholarship, and so therefore, you don't know what you're talking about. Why is it that people? Why do you think that happens in this kind of a dialogue, and why do people die on those types of things? And is it even important to understand some of the challenges in the text?
I think it's important to understand or at least acknowledge that they're there. It's not a neat and tidy process by which we got this book. And by
Mm-hmm.
this book, I mean the entire Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long, messy process that the Holy Spirit superintended, and providence brought us this book, which
Yeah.
is astonishing. And I don't like to get hung up, for me, it would be hanging up. I don't like to get hung up on how all that happened, because I don't think, at least my ability and where I see things going, I don't think we're going to figure it out. And I kind of feel like I got lots of other things that I might stand a chance of figuring out, and I could really get lost in the weeds.
Mm.
Some people enjoy the weeds, and I'm glad there are people who enjoy nitpicking at different things than I enjoy nitpicking at, because we all got our things. But for me, I don't see the meaningful payoff for answering the question definitively.
Mm.
It's not going to change how I understand the meaning of this book. It's a powerful meaning, and
Mm-hmm.
how exactly the book managed to get written on parchment and passed on, for me, I don't care,
Mm.
if I can say that. Um, it's not important to me, and it is important to some scholars. But back to your question. I think we sometimes this is true in all kinds of things, where there's so much information that we grasp for categories and ways to understand and draw conclusions, so that we can say, well, I got that one, now I can move on to something else. And I am like this. I like to solve one thing and not have to go back to it and then move on to something else. But it helps us somehow to have these categories where we can slot people or ideas
Yeah.
and not have to really interact, because there's a lot to interact with. I mean, Colin's book is thick and it's
Yeah.
dense, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But if you're able to say, well, Collins is atheist or whatever, he doesn't say anything, well, then you don't have to deal with it. You don't have to try to sort it. It's hard work, and there's
Yeah.
lots of other hard work to be done. But
Mhm.
we do love our litmus tests. Um, there are several different litmus tests, and I won't try to identify anymore. But the date of Daniel is one of them. That for many people, um, where you come down on that says whether you believe in prophecy or whether you don't. And
Yeah.
that's it's not that simple. It's just not that simple. There
So
are there are evangelical scholars who, I fully believe I will spend eternity with on the new earth. By God's grace, we will all be there, and we're going to have disagreed on this issue.
yeah.
Might not think we'll go, huh, look at that.
Yeah. So that's a really good segue. So I'm gonna step us into another part of the conversation. In your perspective, are there a lot of denominations that how do I want to ask this? When you think about the core tenets of Christianity, right? Like first level, like first tier tenets of Christianity versus the secondary tenets that people disagree on and they don't see eye to eye with, and you don't have to agree with those second tier items in order to like consider yourself, a Christian.
Mhm.
Things like the way people baptize, the beliefs around maybe the afterlife, or but you certainly would want to accept Jesus, for example, as the Savior. Like that's got to be a core tenet. The Trinity is a core tenet. Things like that. Do you find that there are? How do I want to ask this? Do you think that the interpretation of Daniel's visions is something that you should base core tenets of your faith on? I'm going to ask that as general as possible.
You might have to ask it slightly different, so I'm sure I'm tracking.
Okay, so I'm gonna be very detailed. So I'm of the Adventist tradition, is what I was born and raised in. In the Adventist tradition, I'm no longer an Adventist, but in the Adventist tradition, there are several doctrines. One of which is called the investigative judgment. Some of their sanctuary doctrine. Couple of others that play into this as well, because most of them kind of wrestle with each other, that require the 2300-day prophecy and the Roman view, not the Antiochene view of Daniel, to be the way you see it. Because if you don't, you cannot accept about 3 or 4 of the core tenets of the Adventist faith, and therefore I don't know how you can be an Adventist. So do you think that's wise? Do you think that's helpful? What do
Yeah,
you
I
feel about
think
that?
just in terms of interpreting the Bible, I mean, uh, I don't want to generalize too much or speak for too many different fields and disciplines because I am who I am and where I am and all that. But
Yeah.
um, the approach to interpretation that is traditionally and historically wisest is, well, is it Augustine who says, there's I don't even, I shouldn't say that. See, I just ventured somewhere I shouldn't have gone.
That's okay.
There are a lot of things that are clear,
Yeah.
um, and they're clear repeatedly, not just in one place. And
Mhm.
those are the kinds of things that church tradition has said, all right, those are pretty clear. We can all agree on that, mostly, more or less, give or take a little bit. But then there are passages that are just really tricky and
Mm,
they're sort of out there by themselves. Um, and we just sort of scratch our heads. We're I'm not exactly sure how to interpret this. And I don't get a whole lot of help from this other book over here or this biblical author here. So those are places you just want to be careful, I
mm,
think, that you don't that you base your doctrine where the church has uniformly said this is within the bounds of what the apostles would have taught. This is where we're at. When you start to venture outside those things and be really definitive about it,
mhm,
then you should be quite careful.
mm.
And that's just my approach. I don't tend to be a Bible thumper, pulpit pounder. Um,
Yeah. So I appreciate that response. So I want to just maybe move into, before I ask very specific questions around some of the visions. Maybe just kind of go where you want to go with, obviously chapter 7 is important with regards to, I would say Christology, even though that's a anachronistic kind of idea for those reading the book at the time. But what does 8 and on, like, why are they important? Why are there 4 visions? Why are the visions the way they are? Just kind of, what are your initial thoughts on the visions themselves?
Yeah, so we have to include 7 in there because 7 is one of the
Yeah.
visions.
Yeah.
And I'm not uncomfortable using Christological language. Sure, the original audience wouldn't have necessarily they wouldn't have recognized that, but Jesus's favorite title for himself is Son of
Mhm.
Man.
Yep.
And what is it that gets the religious leaders to condemn him and
Yep.
call down blasphemy?
Yep.
It's when he quotes from Daniel 7
Yep.
and he makes the claim to be that Son of Man.
Yeah.
So Jesus clearly sees himself as that person.
Yeah.
I mean, when you read it coming from Genesis going forward, you shouldn't reach too far and yank Jesus back there yet. You do want to read it for what they would have heard
Mhm.
and understood. Um, but certainly the entire Bible is about Jesus.
Yeah.
So we don't want to leave him out. But
Yeah.
um, so there's a vision in chapter 7, there's a vision in chapter 8, and they are related. And the narrator tells us that in the opening verses. First of all, both visions take place during Belshazzar's reign, which is interesting because if you're following the stories, chapter 6, Belshazzar's gone in chapter 5. Chapter 6 is Darius. We're on chronologically, now we're out of order if we're leaping back to Belshazzar. But there's a reason to link back to Belshazzar because who the heck is Belshazzar? He is that prototype for a Gentile king who shakes his fist at God.
Mm.
And in these visions, that's exactly what we're going to see, and then some. So the first chapter 7, it takes place in the first year of Belshazzar. Chapter 8 opens by saying, referring back to that vision, and it's in the third year of Belshazzar. So the text relates them. Chapter 7 and chapter 8, these visions go together. They both feature animals representing kingdoms. They both have a little horn. They are related. Chapter 9, now we're in the reign of Darius, and Daniel is pondering and reflecting on Jeremiah. And then you've got to ask yourself, what in Jeremiah? Because the author of Daniel doesn't tell you. Well, he kind of does. But you can find those references in Jeremiah that he's talking about. It's about how long the exile would be. It'd be 70 years. And we're gonna differ in how we interpret those 70 years, but it'll be 70 years, give or take. And here's Daniel. Think about where he is. What time is on the clock here? If we're in the first year of Darius, we're in about 539-ish, and we could try to figure out who the heck Darius is. We'll save that for another time. We're in about 539, and Daniel says we've been in exile, and if Darius is the king, that means Babylon is gone. So Jeremiah's prophecy has kind of been fulfilled. God destroyed Babylon, but we're still in exile. And what else did Jeremiah say, though? He said, if my people will repent and confess, I will restore them. So what does Daniel proceed to do? He repents and
Mm.
confesses on behalf of his people. And you can read that and think, well, Daniel didn't do all these things. Well, maybe not, but he is owning his people. And he
Mhm.
is saying, we were all bad, from the king to the pauper, east to all of us entirely sinned. We couldn't have done anything worse anymore. We did it all. Forgive us for the sake of your name, for the sake of your temple. And so while Daniel is praying, Gabriel shows up. And Gabriel says he's there in response to Daniel's prayer, which I just love, because what's Daniel praying for? He's praying for an end to exile. And here comes Gabriel saying, I've got the answer for you. And the answer is that, yeah, okay, that exile is almost over, but there's actually a greater exile to come. Probably not the answer Daniel was looking for, but there it was. So there's a vision there, and that is focused on Jerusalem and the events that happen to the holy city. That's vision number 3. which I'll just again say that most of chapter 9 is not a vision. It's Daniel's confession, and we sort of lose that part. All right, then you get to chapter 10 through 12, which are a unit. In chapter 10, Daniel goes to this remarkable, he sees, commentators will disagree on the figure that he sees. I think he's seen a Christophany. Lots of people will say he's seen an angel, but he's seen angels before, and his reaction was nothing like this. And this being, this figure, says he's come to give Daniel a vision of the end. And then for chapters 11 and 12, we get that fourth vision. So those are the four visions. Chapter 7 and 8 are related for sure. And I think they're all related in that they all sort of have the same topic here. We're looking at what happens to God's people in the future, at least the future for Daniel and beyond, because we have the resurrection in chapter 12. So we know we're going beyond just the historical time frame there. So
do you think any of the visions or all of the visions or a portion of the visions are just dealing with Daniel's immediate future versus, I know some like to make it all about when they see end time, they think, oh, this is like eschatology and this is like the end of the world stuff. What are your thoughts on like, and just one added question to that mix. Are these visions the same? Are they cyclical in the way they're like, it's the same thing, but in a different perspective, which is what we get some of in Revelation? Or is that not the case in this type of apocalyptic literature? I know there's a lot there, but just kind of wrestle with whatever you want there.
Well, I would say that Daniel's visions had a somewhat immediate fulfillment, as in a lot of it takes place in that 2nd century with Antiochus Epiphanes and that the Maccabean persecution, all that. So a lot of it has an initial fulfillment, but that's not to say that there can't be secondary and third and fourth fulfillments. So Jesus talks about the abomination that desolates. But certainly during the Maccabean era, they saw that too, but Jesus can reuse it. And it gets reused several times, actually.
So is that considered typology? Is that how you would, not really?
I don't know that I would call it typology. It has additional fulfillment. And I mean, fulfillment sounds like it's done, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. And so, biblical prophecy has what some scholars have described as a telescoping feature. So here's your prophet, and he's looking this way, and everything he sees, it's like looking at the Rocky Mountains from miles away. They all look like they're on the same plane. But as you get closer and as you get into them, you realize that there's depth. But the prophecy itself sometimes collapses all of those into a flat event. So I'm willing to say that I think all of Daniel's prophecies had an initial fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes, that he is a referent for a lot of what's going on there. But I think it's more than that. It goes beyond that, because the New Testament will pick up that language and those authors will reapply it to new situations.
So I like how you explain that. So just like we tend to have, potentially, dual language being used, we have different literary, genres being used. It's interesting that we have what's come out of the interpretive nature of this book. We have kind of a dual interpretation of some of the visions. We have what some call the Roman view, and then we have the Greek view. Antiochus would fit in the Greek view. The Roman view, I would say, is a I don't know if I would say it's a minority now or not, but what are your thoughts on, those two things, and which one would you say, based on your scholarly work, fits more? Kind of help us unwrap some of that.
Yeah, so the names of the visions, or the names of the views being called Greek view and Roman view, come from who you identify as the fourth
Yep.
kingdom, just to be clear. So the Greek view identifies the Greek kingdom, the Greek empire, as the fourth kingdom, and out of that comes the Seleucids and
And that's
the
because they split Medo-Persia. Is that right?
yes, yes, yeah,
Because it's Neo-Babylon, Medo, then Persia, then Greek, I
yeah,
believe. Yeah.
yep, yep. And then yeah, where was I going with this? What did you ask?
The Roman view. I'm sorry, I cut you off. The
That's all
Roman
right.
view
So
then.
the Roman view sees Rome as the fourth kingdom, from which comes ultimately Antichrist. One thing I would say about the views is those aren't the only two views. First of all,
Mhm.
there are others, but each one of them has difficulties that
Mhm.
they have to sort out,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's a matter of which difficulties make the best sense, or which interpretation makes the best sense of the difficulties. I will say, just coming at Daniel from understanding it as a piece of literature, written by authors with intent and incredible craft and art, that I find the Greek view more persuasive because of the relationship between chapter 7 and chapter 8. Um, I think the little horn is the same. And chapter 8, we actually get an angel to tell us who's what, and that's great.
Yep.
Chapter 7, we don't get that. Um, so in my view, that makes better sense of the structure of the book and the literature of the book. Now, having said that, I think some people are hesitant to take or accept the Greek view because they wrongly assume that that means you don't see fulfillment of any kind in Jesus, that there's no messianic
Yeah.
perspective here.
Yeah.
Um, but that is not the case. Now, that may be true for some, but certainly not for all people who have the Greek view.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's how. So, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And I think it's important, just as we're dialoguing with other people, um, that we not
Sorry.
that we not make blanketed statements. Oh, your view is the Roman view, and therefore your da 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 da, or your view is the Greek view, and therefore da da da.
Right.
I think it's really
Right.
important that we dialogue with each other. We
Yeah.
value each other in this discourse that we have with a very complicated, difficult book.
Yeah.
Um,
And one
so
thing that I think is unfortunate about some Bible translations, they don't help in this, when they provide headings. So
yeah,
some I know at least the old NASB. I'm not sure if the 2020 version has it. They put and headings can be really helpful for helping you track how a book is flowing and how a story is working. That I'm not saying headline, these headings, which are put in by editorial teams, by the way, not by the biblical authors. Um, but in the visions, they actually do tag it as Rome,
yeah,
Greece. So then you're like, oh, this is Rome, which is
yeah,
really interpretive decision
yeah.
that the editorial team made that they didn't need to make.
Yep. So let's go back to, because the 2300-day prophecy is really important to, most of the people that probably are watching right now. um, Talk a little bit about the 2300 evenings, mornings, Daniel 8:14. It's sparked quite a bit of debate. It may not have sparked a lot of debate, maybe in your tradition. Um, I don't know, particularly, but for my tradition, and my upbringing, it was like the linchpin. Like if you disagreed with it, and the traditional view was 2300 evening mornings, that was days. Then you take the day for a year, and then you make it 2300 years, and then you figure out when it's. I mean, it was like this whole timeline to
Mhm.
future date things, and it just became
Yeah.
the biggest problem being that if you don't start right and then you get an error somewhere, then all of a sudden you're off, and like it's really dangerous, I think, doing that. But talk a little bit about what your understanding of the 2,300 days. Is it 2,300? Is it 1,150?
I'm going to have to go find my footnote, Mike. I told you I don't do numbers after a certain hour here. There are 3 views. I know that. I honestly don't remember what they are. So
well,
I can look it up and find my footnote.
Yeah, maybe just respond like, why do you think that matters with regards to maybe the view that you take, the Greek view, the Roman view, or does it matter? Like, does it play a role?
Well, I don't count years and numbers and days in Daniel, because it becomes way too easy to get lost in details that we have no way of verifying.
Yeah.
So I don't know when it starts. When you run into this, when you get to, this isn't your question, but it's more in my head. When you get to chapter 9, the vision of the 70 weeks, when do the 70 weeks start?
Yep.
What's the word that goes out? There are 3 options for that. So which one do you pick, and how do you know you've picked the right one? Well, you can make an argument for picking the one you pick, but then all the pieces after that have to fit until we've so dissected a vision that we don't even know what it means anymore. And generally speaking, that's not the way Old Testament prophecy works. We don't get those kinds of details where we can, mark on the wall when things are going to happen. Daniel's really unusual in that respect, because that's not the way Daniel doesn't look like an Old Testament prophet. Let me just put it that way. An Old Testament prophet, the job of the prophet was to remind the people of covenant and call them back to faithfulness, call them to repent, and to warn them of judgment. And do you know who Daniel does that to in the book of Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar. And then in chapter 9, he is acting like a prophet in that he is representing his people in repentance before God.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying Daniel's not a prophet. Jesus calls him a prophet. But how those prophecies work, I am not comfortable trying to be exact, because I don't see that pattern in the Bible being exact and precise. And I think in some ways, I think we're bringing our modern perspective, our modern scientific, gotta have every dot, I dotted, T crossed, measured. We're bringing that to this ancient text and a worldview that was so different from ours. And we could go way off here, and I could get us lost in Genesis 1 and have the same sort of discussion, because we bring our modern perceptions of what history ought to look like in writing, what science ought to look like in writing, and we try to overlay that into a book that was not written to be any of those things.
Yeah.
So we get into a mess fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like getting in that mess. So I don't.
And
my commentary footnotes those opinions. It footnotes the options for you. But in many of them, I don't take a position.
Yeah.
Because I think you get lost too fast and you lose people along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and this is very ironic to the overall theology, I think, of the book of Daniel. It lends itself towards spiritual arrogance, claiming I've got it right, I know exactly the way it is, and then the ego gets bigger and bigger, and like my way's right and you're wrong, and then it becomes divisive, which ultimately isn't what any of the books of the Bible should be about. It should be about unifying the body of Christ in the ultimate work of redemption. So, yeah, I appreciate that response. even though some in the chat
It'll
may
be
not.
it'll be very unsatisfying for many in your audience.
And
I'll
that's
just tell
fine.
you
That's great.
the views are here in the footnotes, with how I navigate through them and
Yeah.
where I come out instead. But
Yeah.
honestly, I just don't remember because this
That's
came out a
great.
couple. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
didn't
good.
read it today.
And by the way, those of you that are watching, like, this is a recent commentary. I mean, it was what, 2023, is that right? That it came out?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is recent scholarship. So I would definitely add it to the list of several that you have. And just as a plug, if you're doing biblical study like this justice, don't just get one scholar. You need several. You need to kind of see how scholars talk back and forth about things and engage in the issues in the text. Before we talk a little bit about the academic world, I'm going to ask maybe one last Adventist related question. I'm trying to be careful because I want you to come back and I don't want you to. So inside of the Adventist framework, Adventists will typically identify the little horn in Daniel 8 with Rome, pagan Rome, the kind of in general. Daniel 7, they tend to be more specific as it being papal Rome. Do you think there is, maybe I'll say this, like textual evidence of that? Do you think that would be a valid way of looking at it? And part of this is the overall Adventist framework ultimately identifies the Antichrist as papal Rome. Now, they're not the only ones that maybe do that. I don't think that's fair for, I don't know. I'll just leave that where it is. But do you think that there's textual evidence? Do you feel like that kind of gets into the weeds and there isn't enough? I just kind of share your thoughts on that perspective.
Yeah, well, I have the Greek perspective, so I think the fourth kingdom is Greece, and the little horn is an outgrowth of that kingdom. So in chapter 8, I mean, we get Gabriel's help here. He tells us who the
Yep.
ram and the goat are, and so I'll just put it out there that most scholars, at least non-Adventist scholars, will identify the little horn in chapter 8 as Antiochus.
Mhm.
There's pretty near unanimous consensus on that. The question, at least among conservative, evangelical, and critical scholars, the problem comes with chapter 7 and who that little horn is.
Mm.
So critical scholars and evangelical scholars who hold the Greek view will say the little horn is the same. It's the same referent. It makes the best sense, literarily speaking, to see it as the same referent. And since chapter 8, we pretty much all think, the rest of us think it's Antiochus, then we think chapter 7 is also Antiochus.
Yeah.
Whereas traditional scholars or scholars with the Roman view, scholars with the Roman view, non-Adventist ones will say the little horn in chapter 8 is Antiochus, but the little horn in chapter 7 is Antichrist, or somebody connected with Rome. So they'll make it. They'll say they have two different referents.
Mm.
So the Greek view, it's the same referent. The Roman view, it's different. But most, again, scholars there's pretty near consensus that the little horn in chapter 8 is Antiochus, just because Gabriel helps us.
And would you say in your research, in preparing for your the writing of your commentary, did you feel compelled at all to 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 utilize or buy into the connections that the Adventist, scholarship kind of goes towards? Like, was it useful to you? Do you feel like that's such a minority? Do you feel like it's weak? I'm not kind of leading the question. I'm just curious what your overarching thoughts are on.
Yeah, well, it didn't influence my view. whatever. And I did this research so long ago, I can't even tell you who I all read, but that view wouldn't have been persuasive enough to me to take it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for me, literarily speaking, and just reading the sense of the book, if you can somehow manage to leave the baggage, interpretive baggage that we all bring behind, and just read the book without having any kind of agenda for who has to be who, and you don't have the subheadings that try to tell you who's who, just on the surface reading, it makes reading sense for that little horn to be the same. And that was where I ended up. And so that took me to the view where I am.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Most of, again, just so that you know where all of this is coming from. And this is part of the reason why it's so difficult. I was born and raised Adventist. Like when I say born and raised, third, fifth generation, raised in the church. My dad was an Adventist pastor, was educated in that tradition. It's all I knew my entire life until my wife and I and our family came out of Adventism just in the last, 3-4 years. And it was because we studied ourselves out of it, because we were trying to reconcile some of these things that we had always been taught. Daniel is a big piece of it. Revelation is a big piece of it. They are, they claim to be experts in Daniel and Revelation, which is kind of, in and of itself ironic, because they're complicated. It's difficult. Those are difficult books. But getting all this right in the Adventist framework is imperative, and you can't miss any of it. Like for the Adventist, it's got to be 2,300 years. It's got to start in 457 AD when the decree, one of the 4 options of the decree, goes out to build the temple. And then it has to get to 1844, which for them is a big play in their theological construct with the investigative judgment and the sanctuary doctrine and all this stuff that goes on.
Yeah.
Which it just seems like fairy tales for me.
Well, theological constructs are tricky. We all have them. The extent to which we will hold them unwaveringly will differ, but in one sense, we need them. We have to make sense of things. It was like that slotting things, and if you have to be able to have a framework. So I get that, but the framework can't supersede the text.
Yeah. So as we're coming up on the 2-hour mark, let me jump into something that some may or may not be familiar with. Inevitably, when you get into some of this prophecy stuff, people will hear, and I am not Latin, so I don't know how to say Latin phrases. Okay.
I don't either.
But
Carpe diem.
I know. the concept of prophecy after the fact, I guess it's called
ex
Vaticinium ex eventu. I don't know how to say that. Okay. But inevitably it does come up, like this concept. Critical scholarship, says, hey, this is the fact. We see potential either authors or scribal editing that's maybe looking back, or maybe a unknown prophet that we don't know is looking back on the events and then is ascribing prophecy to it. That's that Latin phrase that I don't know how to say. What are your thoughts on any of that? Is it critical for us to even engage in that? Does it matter? Like, did it play a role in your overall commentary? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah. So it's prophecy after the fact, or after the event. That's what we're talking about. So just by way of example, let's say I wanted to write the history of the United States as a prophecy, but for an audience today, and I would put myself back in time, and I would tell the history of the United States as if it's a prophecy. And Lincoln will be president from, or I probably wouldn't call him Lincoln. I would give some, general name, and my prophecy would be spot on, because of course I'm just recounting history, right? Until I got to the present, and the future. And then if I actually tried to tell you some of the future, my information might not prove to be accurate. So it's prophecy ex eventu, or prophecy after the fact, is a literary device that is known in the ancient world, maybe not extensively, but it is there, where somebody uses, and I don't mean use in a deceptive way, but they take on the name of a respected person from the past. In the case of Daniel, it would be Daniel, obviously. And they recount history as if it's a prophecy. And then when it gets to where that person, I know this is all very confusing. It's getting late, so
I know.
no
I
idea
know.
this is making any sense. Yeah, how far do you want me to go on this anyway? Because
Well, I want that's enough for people to understand probably what it is. We don't have to get into all the granular details. The reason why I bring it up is inevitably this comes up with regards to dating
yeah,
and authorship and all that stuff.
yeah,
I think people's knee-jerk reaction is that if you accept that, then the response is you're destroying inspiration, prophecy, the
yeah,
divine nature of gospel. You're a
right,
heretic. Like that's
right,
the path down
yeah,
which people go. Is
yep.
that fair? Is that fair to conclude that?
It's not necessarily fair, and here's the reason. And I'm not saying this is the view I hold. I'm just trying
Yeah.
to allow for a generosity of view and
Yep.
a better representing the view, perhaps. So it's not fair for us to say the Bible can't use a given genre from the ancient world. If this indeed was a genre, a literary way of writing that would have been known to the audience, it's not familiar to us at all, but if it was familiar to that kind of audience, um, then why couldn't God use it? God uses the genres. He uses the tools of communication that, well, I'd say we have, but the Bible's written before. So he uses those tools that they have for communicating. We don't get to decide which ones are good and which ones are bad. If God chose to use it, he chose to use it, and he can still communicate his truth in the way he wants it communicated.
Mm-hmm.
So all I'm saying is, if it's a literary device that was known to the ancient audience and the ancient authors, for them to use it, for God to choose to use it through them, uh, that's not my problem. I mean, it is my problem because I don't understand how it works necessarily, but it doesn't mean it's wrong or bad or off limits. It just means
Yeah.
I don't quite understand it. And I wouldn't have chosen to do it that way, but I didn't. Who cares? I would have chosen to do.
Yeah.
So that's
So I
the
think
issue.
I think what I'm hearing you say is again, when we pick up conversations and dialogue about the real issues inside of Daniel, especially since that's the topic, we need to come with a certain amount of humility, grace. We need to be gracious to people. We shouldn't seek to divide. We need to seek to understand. And ultimately, is it pointing others to Christ? I think ultimately should be our outcome and goal. Now, I get it. Some people say, well, certain views take away the Messiah, or take away, the Prince of Princes, or take away certain elements that they hold very dear to them, especially in certain traditions. And
Yeah,
and it's good for us to be obviously self-aware of how that might be on the other side of the conversation.
yeah.
Um, but
No, I for
yeah,
sure think the book of Daniel and Revelation, the entire Bible for that matter, but really difficult books,
yeah,
they require humility. I
yeah,
mean, please forgive me if I have
yeah,
communicated in a way that doesn't value another tradition's understanding, but goodness sake, we
yeah,
all need the humility and grace to listen and hear. And that's true in all of Christian discourse for sure.
yeah.
We could use a lot more of it.
Well, it is obviously late. It's getting later, hour and 50 minutes in, and I promised I wouldn't go over at least 2 hours.
And there was a time change, Mike, for goodness
I
sake.
know we didn't think about that when we started this out. Why don't we maybe just end on like how would you hope as an academic? I think one of my passions, I consider myself as of right now maybe an armchair theologian that's on the way to becoming an academic. Obviously, I'm getting my THM with DTS, and then onwards to my PhD, Lord willing. But knowing that there's so many people out there that deeply want to know the Word of God and they want to understand things that are complicated in the Word, and knowing that you all spend massive amounts of time and energy and resources on one book, and just really trying to dissect and figure out the details of it. How would you want um, lay Christians to engage in academic work? How should we be using academic work like the commentaries that you've put out?
Well, I would hope, first of all, before you read any commentary, that you just read the text. Um, it is God's word, no matter what we have to say about it, and read it humbly and read it lots. And one of my seminary professors encouraged us early on to read from Genesis to Revelation as fast as you can, as often as you can. And I have not followed
Yeah.
his advice very well, but the first time I did it, I thought, yeah, really, right? You've got to be kidding me. How can I read this fast? But I did it, and it gave me a whole different perspective on the whole picture.
Yeah.
Um, because sometimes we come to Bible study and we're so focused on the text we're trying to understand. So we've got our commentaries and we've got our word study, we've got all the tools, all the valuable tools to understand a specific text. And they're all good and they're all helpful. Well, they're not
Mhm.
all good, but it's helpful. But if we get lost in the forest, we've got to see the big picture, and all of those individual texts have to fit in that bigger picture.
Mm.
And we lose it. I lose it. I get stuck in what I'm studying, what I'm looking at. But we have to get the whole story, and we need to talk about it. We need to do it with other people, because that's part of where you can hear yourself say things that are weird. Like, oh, yeah, no, that doesn't work.
Yeah,
Um,
and that comment there, I mean, it's funny because we do tend as Christians to silo ourselves into,
yeah,
you know, groups of communities that think just like us around the
right.
traditions that we value, and those groupthink mentalities can really get ingrained in the way we see
Mhm.
Scripture. And so, I think what I'm hearing you say is, um, wrestle with the text. It is the word of God, but don't do it alone. Do it with other people. Do it with people that pursue it diligently, just like you were pursuing it diligently. That maybe don't agree with you entirely.
Mhm.
Um, is that what academics do? Do they want to engage in the work of other scholars in their work?
Um, I think it depends on the scholar, on the academic. Um, Sometimes no, we're just as siloed as everybody else, but
Mm,
the better part of wisdom says we should, because all
mm,
the other disciplines, they're all pieces of this puzzle.
yeah.
My part-time job is editing books for publishers in Grand Rapids, and I often read books that are not in my field. I'm reading one right now that's about psychology, Christian use of psychology, and it's not my field, but I'm like, this is good. It's good to think outside my
Mm,
box and to see how these other realms of information and
mm,
disciplines of study contribute and help us better understand um, the, the the creation. what God has given us. Because, there's the Bible, but there's also all of what He's made
Yeah.
that informs how we understand.
Yeah. That's great. Well, listen, friend, thank you so much for being here. I will be kind and gracious and not give you a number, year, calculation thing in the last 5 minutes of our time together.
Well, you know what? Let me just preempt that whole thing. So Daniel 9, the vision of the 70 weeks, is a place to really get lost in the weeds.
Yeah.
And I've seen some journal articles. I'm like, I can't get past the first page because I just can't sort and keep track of all the numbers. But I find the message of that vision to point to Jesus more than the numbers ever could, because that vision draws on the Levitical concept of Sabbath rest and fulfillment of and the judgment that comes for sin. And so Israel is living in this place where there's this sevenfold judgment, but then there's going to be like a tenfold restoration. So their exile is about to end. Their 70-year, 40, whatever, however long the exile is, take your pick. However long it is, it's going to end. But then there's this greater exile to come. But the rescue from that exile, that bondage to sin that we're all in, it's Jesus. And it's a beautiful, symbolic pulling together of Old Testament themes that its original audience would have known instantly. They would have known this is pulling on the covenant curses and the covenant blessings and the restoration that's promised. And that restoration comes through the Jubilee.
Yeah.
Jesus is the Jubilee. That's Daniel 9.
I love that. What a
Mind
good
the years
place.
and the days. Don't
Yep.
count them.
I love it. And with that, I think I would encourage all of you here, go back and take away all your biases as best you can, put aside all your traditions, put aside all the stuff you've been taught already, and go read about the 70 weeks and see if it points you to Christ. I love that. I love that challenge. I would say we need to do that every single time we come to the text. Yeah, it's a little more difficult in places where the text doesn't seem like to really point to Jesus, and maybe it's ultimately pointing us towards who's going to ultimately fulfill, some of the things that are going on. But I love that approach. And by the way, I would say those of you, I'm going to put these back on the screen. These commentaries and these books that you've written, that one in the middle is predominantly about how everything does point to Christ. That's kind of the whole commentary set is designed around that construct. Is like how do each of the books in Scripture kind of point you towards Christology, towards Christ. So go pick up one of these books. Go read it, whether you agree with it or not. It'll be worth your time. Wendy, any final thoughts, words, anything before we exit out?
I think I'm all talked out.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time. I so appreciate gaining another friend, another scholar. I hope you'll come back. Maybe we'll talk about something more lighthearted next time. But maybe we'll talk about editing and how that works and how the editorial world functions. That might be something of interest. So, but thank you so much. I pray that God will continue to bless you, bless your work, bless your family. Thank you so much. I consider you a sister in Christ. Thank you so much for engaging this evening. And guys, thank you so much for spending time with us. We will see you on the next live stream. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next time, okay?